How's it going, everybody? My name is Kaden, and welcome back to LabPadre. This week at Starbase, with Flight 11 done and dusted, crews are hard at work assembling Ship 39 and Booster 18. Meanwhile, Gigabay construction continues, and teams get right to work with teardowns and modifications to Pad 1 and its surrounding infrastructure. While we know that the launch mount will be completely demolished and replaced ahead of the debut of V3, just how extensive will the changes be at Pad 1? To find out, let's dig right into this week's update. Starting off this week, LabPadre's own rover camera caught steel being lifted to the right side of Gigabay 2 for new access platforms in the ship assembly facility. The next day, Ship 39's nose cone was lifted to that same side of Gigabay 2, and less than 2 hours later, the rocket's forward dome section was brought into the building and the nose cone was lifted above it. Once connected, the two articles were then lifted onto the turntable to be joined. On Wednesday, the final section of Booster 18, the first V3 Super Heavy vehicle, was brought out of the Star Factory and taken across the ring yard into Gigabay 1. The bottom of this methane tank will now be joined with the rest of the tank, and once that happens, the next big event will be the mating of that tank with the liquid oxygen tank. Last weekend, out in front of the bays, crews continued work assembling the tower cranes for the construction of the massive Giga Bay. By Monday, the first boom was lifted onto the first of the cranes, and a few hours later, as the workers retreated, the boom was raised under its own power, signaling that the crane was almost ready for work. Several deliveries of steel were brought to the site on Tuesday as construction of the building continues on to the next phase. That afternoon, crews began lifting columns into position for workers to bolt into place. This work was completed with the on-site crawler crane, not the new tower crane. As all of that steel work continued, the crane crew switched their focus to the next tower crane, and by Friday afternoon, the cabin mast for that crane had been lifted and installed. Meanwhile, stacking began for the next two tower cranes. Once complete, these four cranes will work together to speed the construction of the Gigabay. Have I said crane enough times yet? Meanwhile, down at the launch complex, the push is on to demolish the outdated equipment at Pad 1. On Sunday, crews got to work on the chopsticks, removing the pusher cars and ship lifting pins from the arms. On Monday, demolition of the berm between Pad 1 and the tank farm began, with excavators breaking up and pulling down a section of the barrier's concrete cover. On Tuesday and Wednesday, the vent lines were removed from the tops of the liquid oxygen subcoolers on the Pad 1 side of the tank farm. This removal begins what will most likely be a major redesign of how the original end of the tank farm is utilized. Later in the week, the focus shifted to the liquid oxygen pumps. First, the motors were removed, then crews began lifting the pumps themselves out. It's not yet clear if all of this will be replaced or instead removed and later reinstalled in the new layout. Once all the liquid oxygen pumps were removed, the sumps that had previously housed them quickly followed suit. On Wednesday, an interesting delivery was taken to the launch complex, likely to be used on the cable for Tower 1. The next day, the lifting cable for the Pad 1 chopsticks was unreeved, paving the way for the removal of the arms from the tower. It's likely that they'll be replaced by the shorter arm design we see on Pad 2. On Friday, crews began removing the liquid oxygen feed piping to the subcoolers. And later that afternoon, crews were observed painting lines on the side of the Pad 1 launch mount, likely marking where they will cut as the massive structure is taken apart. Meanwhile, over at Pad 2, crews worked this week to install more protective steel panels covering part of the top deck water manifold as well as other parts of the service structure. It also appears that SpaceX have been busy installing catch hardware on the Pad 2 chopsticks. In this photo, we can see what appears to be the catch bumpers on the starboard chopstick. Venting was seen coming from the Massey's outpost tank farm on Wednesday as SpaceX performed some testing of the infrastructure there as well. Now, switching over to our Falcon 9 updates, we have a lot of them. On Sunday afternoon, Booster 1067 lifted off for a fleet-leading 31st time as it launched the Starlink Group 10-17 mission from Space Launch Complex 40, carrying another 28 satellites to orbit. Less than 2 hours later, on the other side of the country, the Starlink Group 11-19 mission lifted off from Vandenberg Space Launch Complex 4E, also carrying another 28 satellites to add to the ever-growing constellation. As if that wasn't enough, yet another Starlink mission launched from Vandenberg on Wednesday morning, a turnaround of less than 3 days for the pad and actually breaking the record by about 3 hours. For this mission, booster 1075 flew for the 21st time and, like her sister rockets, delivered 28 satellites to low Earth orbit. Space Launch Complex 40 then saw its second launch of the week on Thursday night as booster 1076 lifted off for not a Starlink mission, but rather the SpainSat NG-2 mission. The rocket carried a next-generation communications satellite for Hisdesat for its 22nd and final launch in a rare expendable mission for SpaceX. In other space news, Muon Space announced this week a partnership with SpaceX to integrate Starlink's laser terminals into their Halo platform. This will allow Muon to essentially remove any latency from their network, as it will have access to Starlink's entire global infrastructure and all the speed and connectivity that comes with it. The Chinese company Landspace have announced that they have completed a wet dress rehearsal and static fire of their Juche 3 reusable launch vehicle, paving the way for the rather familiar-looking rocket's maiden flight in the near future. The launch of the Artemis 2 mission moved one step closer this week as NASA announced that they had completed integration of the mission's Orion spacecraft, Integrity. This was the final major piece of hardware to be installed on the SLS rocket before launch, which is currently scheduled for early 2026. Footage was shared this week of the demolition of one of the old Zenit service towers at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan as Roscosmos clears the way for the debut of the Soyuz 5 rocket. Back in the States, the United Launch Alliance announced that the initial assembly of the Atlas V rocket for the upcoming Viasat 3 F2 mission has been completed. The company has now progressed into pre-flight testing in preparation for a launch early next month, carrying a communication satellite to geostationary orbit. Speaking of ULA, their CEO, Tori Bruno, shared footage of a test of one of their launch head swing arms for their second Vulcan mobile launch platform. 4 of these hold the rocket down in the lead up to launch, then release after ignition and quickly rotate out of the way. ULA also announced this week that they have now taken delivery of the 30th BE-4 engine from Blue Origin for use on the Vulcan rockets. Stoke Space shared a video from a test of their water suppression systems at Launch Complex 14 in Cape Canaveral. This pad will utilize a water-cooled flame bucket similar to what we see at the new Starship pads and will eventually support Stoke's Nova small satellite launch vehicle. And finally, Blue Origin CEO Dave Limp posted that the company has completed integration of the first and second stages of their New Glenn rocket in preparation for its second launch. The integrated stack was moved to the transporter erector and is undergoing final checkouts and umbilical tie-ins ahead of a rollout to the pad at Space Launch Complex 36 and a static fire test. And that should do it for this week's spaceflight update here at LabPadre. To make sure you never miss a breaking story in the world of spaceflight, be sure to stay tuned for future content coming out from the channel. Until next time, goodbye!